Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of A Novel Review, a book podcast. My name is Seamus, and if this is your first time clicking on, thank you so much for clicking on. I really do appreciate it. Basically, I do what it says on the tin. I do a different book every week, and this week is no different. This week I am exploring the novella, The Victorian Chaise Lounge by Marghanita Laski. I'm also going to speak about Marghanita Laski herself as an author, as a person, because I think she's a super interesting character and she deserves her moment in the spotlight, definitely. So I'll get into that in a bit. But first, I just want to say thanks so much for clicking on. I really do appreciate it. I hope we've all got a cup of tea or a cup of coffee or maybe something a little bit stronger if we need it to get through the day. I hope everyone has fantastic books that they're reading or, books that they're writing, whatever your tipple is. I just hope you're well. I hope you're doing well. And yeah, thanks so much for clicking on. I really do appreciate it. If you would like to like and subscribe, I'd also really love that as well. But it is a free podcast, so let's get on with the show. Okay, The Victorian Chaise Lounge by Marghanita Laski. I've got all my notes here. The notes went over a page and onto a second page, which doesn't happen often. And I think that's because I have so much to say about Marghanita. She's got so many interesting, she's a very interesting character. And I think we're going to start with the book itself, actually, the publishing house of the book, which I think is super important to highlight. It's published by Persephone Books, and they have a bookshop by the same name. They're based in the UK, in Bath, which I had the absolute pleasure of traveling to and then visiting the shop itself. Shopkeepers were absolutely wonderful. They were really, really helpful, and they had a great knowledge of almost every single book in there, which is really cool. And the reason I just wanted to give them a shout out is because since their inception in, I think it was 1999, they have been working, and they work towards publishing almost exclusively out-of-print women from the 20th century, which is really, really cool because there have been a number of women writers that have just been lost to the annals of history for a reason that I'm sure we're all probably aware of. But I'll get into that a bit more in the episode. So I went in there, had a lovely chat to the storekeeper. She was very knowledgeable, helped me pick out a few books, and this was one of them. I had a bit of a break in the podcast reading cycle and just needed something sort of to jump into. This book jumped out at me, obviously being quite short. I could smash it in a day or two, which I absolutely did, and it was fantastic. I'm going to start this by saying this is a near perfect story, a near perfect novella. It builds and builds and builds like nothing else. It was absolutely fantastic. The fact that she was forgotten in history was an absolute crime. But let's get into it. I've got all my notes here, so let's start reading some of these notes. So Marghanita Laski was born in 1915, and she tragically passed away in 1988. She was a British journalist, novelist, playwright, and critic. And then perhaps most interestingly, she was actually a major contributor to the Oxford English Dictionary. Now, we'll come back to that. Why was she forgotten through history? I mean, I've just said it's a near perfect story. She's crafted this absolute masterpiece of a short story that sort of is very creepy but very wonderful to read as well. Why was she forgotten? She's not a bad writer. What are the reasons? Now, there's not one particular reason that we can really point to and say this is why you've fallen out of print. I mean, essentially it probably falls down to sales, which is, the reason most people fall out of print. But obviously, why aren't people reading her book? What was it? Well, literary marginalization. So her work was labeled as too domestic or middlebrow, and then the fact that it's a woman writing it, it gets sort of underrated a lot more, which is, just rubbish. Her work is viewed through a sexist lens, which is absolutely tragic. She's writing about motherhood, grief, guilt, the domesticity, which is less serious than the things going on at the time, or perceived as less serious as the things going on at the time. The 20th century, you've got World War One, but then, through the body of her life, World War Two, you've got war, you've got politics, these big ideas, these big things that are going on. Who wants to read sort of a little story about the domestic life of a woman? No one wants to read that. That's ridiculous. It's a shame, because if people paid a bit more attention to their domestic lives, we'd probably have less wars. I feel like I just went on a little rant there. Shifting taste. This is an interesting one. She's writing about things like psychological realism and ethical dilemmas, which have fallen out of style at this particular period in time. She's not experimental enough or gritty enough for those postmodernists and realists, which is kind of interesting because she was very much a person that wanted to, I was going to say live in the now, but that sounds so cliche. But she was very much aware of sort of social issues going on, and she wanted to capture those, and she does capture those through her contributions to the Oxford English Dictionary. So it's kind of interesting that she's not seen as, gritty enough for the postmodernist or realist enough for the realist and all these things. She's writing about psychological realism and these ethical dilemmas in the domestic space, and that's not seen as, as important enough. But the one thing that I loved about her, and this is probably, she clearly has a passion for words and passion for the English language, because now this is a rumored number. Don't quote me on this exact number, and it's probably not this exact amount. It could be more, it could be less though. She has reportedly sent in 250,000 slips to the Oxford English Dictionary, which is an absolutely momentous effort on her behalf. Now, what was really interesting was she had a really love and a close attention to modern words and phrases, as English was very much shifting post-World War II. And actually, there's a really good book that I'd forgotten about until just now called The Dictionary of Lost Words by Pip Williams, who's an Australian author, if I'm remembering that correctly. Yes, she is. And that's about a book about the Oxford English Dictionary being written and the story is told from the position of a young girl sort of growing up in this space where her father is contributing to the Oxford English Dictionary and helping compile the first Oxford English Dictionary. And she notices all these slips keep falling and keep being forgotten, and certain words are overlooked for various reasons. Again, sort of the feministic lens of the story. And it's this creation of the Dictionary of Lost Words. Really cool story, and now that I've sort of linked the two up, Marghanita Laski could be the main character in that book, because she had a really close attention to modern words. She was responding to these new cultural realities, and she was really insistent that the Oxford English Dictionary not be this dusty old relic of, the King's proper English, and it actually be reflective of the society that the book is living in and evolving in and is being utilized for. Because just because I speak a little differently, being a tradie from down the road working in the brickworks or something like that, doesn't make my language, my words, my conception of the English language and pronunciation of particular words any less relevant than someone that was educated at the, I don't know, what's a famous English school, Eton or something like that. She really understood and wanted the book to capture this understanding that if you live in England and speak English, that English is in a constantly evolving body of work, and it needs to be reflective of that and capture people actually within the lower socioeconomic societies, because they're human beings that deserve to be represented as well. So I really loved that, and I think, obviously sending in 250,000 words is just such a momentous effort. I do have some of the words here that she sent in. That's, it's rumored that she was sort of like the first to send them in. She's not the one who created these words, but she started to notice words being used in different contexts and having therefore different meanings. So she's apparently sent in the word bikini, which is the first time the word was being used to reference a two-piece bikini swimsuit and not just Bikini Atoll, the place where they tested bombs. She flagged the word alienation, which I didn't even know this, but it was originally a legal term for transferring property. But then alienation started to come out within sort of social spheres as being this word where you're feeling very alienated, which is very, very cool. So that was just two words that are rumored to have sort of come from her as she recognized them in the sort of social settings that were changing and shifting at the time that she was living in. And she, like I said, she really wanted the Oxford English Dictionary to reflect the fact that English is not a stagnant language. It is a constantly evolving piece of work, and it has to, therefore, if it is evolving, it has to therefore reflect the people who are living in the English language and speaking the English language of the time. So that was a bit about Marghanita Laski herself. Let's talk now about the Victorian Chaise Lounge, which, in my opinion, is a near-perfect story. Near-perfect novella, near-perfect story, really, really fascinating story. I think what I loved about it is it starts a bit slow. I should do an overview. It's about a woman that is quite sick, and she goes to sleep on a chaise lounge, and then she wakes up and it's 80 years earlier and she finds herself in a different woman's body, And of course, she doesn't know what's going on, and no one around her believes that she is someone from 80 years in the future. And that's what the story is about. It starts off quite slow. The first 10 pages are a bit like, what's going on here? We've got, 97 pages we're working with here, and we're spending the first 10 not really doing much. But the thing is with this story, it just kind of builds. And then page by page, it just continues to build and build and build. And I'm going to say it builds right up until the last paragraph, maybe even the last sentence. I obviously won't speak about what happens, and I'm going to not reveal sort of what happens in the story, because as you're going through this story, you start to question what's going on within the story. It from the outset looks like it's a story about time travel. But then you start to wonder, is it time travel? Or has this person from 80 years previously just had an hallucination that they were 80 years in the future? Or is this person 80 years in the future having a hallucination that they are 80 years in the past? Is it just a massive dream sequence? Then I kind of got a bit worried that maybe she fell out of print because the last line was, and then I woke up. And I started to get worried about that. And you start to wonder what this story is doing. Is it a time travel story? Is it a hallucination story? Is it this woman that's sort of had a mental episode and she is imagining different things? And it's this really intense story that doesn't insist upon itself at all. It just kind of builds with this absolute creepy but absolutely beautiful language. And it was that sheer ability to just build page on page on page and make you start to question different things at different times about what the story was actually doing and what it was actually exploring, that made it just such a wonderfully fresh, and it's so funny to say wonderfully fresh because obviously it's quite an old story, but it just made it this wonderfully fresh, very simple, direct storyline, even though it's not direct in the way it's exploring things, but just kind of direct in what it's telling you. And I simply loved it for that, because it was just this, I guess because it's just this story that came out of nowhere for me. I sort of picked it up at this bookshop. It's an out-of-print woman. I'm like, yeah, it's a novella. I'll give it a go. And then you open it up and you're like blown away, and you're like, how the hell could something like this ever fall out of print? Obviously, the reasons I spoke about before are, probably the major reasons it fell out of print. But you read it now and you're just like, that was absolutely fantastic. And I don't know, maybe it's just looking at it from a modern lens of, there's a lot of questions at the moment around, is the publishing industry in decline, or are books in decline, sort of writing styles in decline? Are stories getting worse? Is there, a close attention paid on literature anymore? Or is everyone just looking for that sort of very much book book that is just going to like be a flash in the pan, make, sell 10,000 books in the first week and then be forgotten? So to have a book like this that is really well written and builds and builds and builds with this absolute intensity, also coupled with the fact that Marghanita Laski, clearly has a love of language and a complete control over the story as she's building it as well, just really makes for this really wonderful read. And I was absolutely blown away, and straight away it just became like one of my favorite novellas. I would really recommend you checking it out. I'm obviously being incredibly sparse on the details of the story because I don't want to rob you of any of the magic that goes on within the pages, but it was just a cool story, like really, really cool. So I'd absolutely recommend it. What would I rate this? I would rate this a 4.7 out of 5. I really enjoyed it that much. I just wanted to say before I end this episode as well, it was funny because I went to Persephone Books to buy, these few different books, and I picked up 2 books, and it wasn't until after I'd left the shop, I think it was even live on air here doing the podcast, that I realized I'd picked up 2 Marghanita Laski books. I naturally wasn't too much looking at the authors. I figured they're all out of print. It doesn't really matter who they are. I was just looking for what sounded interesting, and I picked up this other book by her, Little Boy Lost, and it sounded absolutely fascinating as well. And it's, I guess, just a testament to her as a writer, the fact that I read 2 blurbs and thought they both sounded fascinating without realizing that it's the same author writing them. But I'll tell you what, it made me very excited to read Little Boy Lost. So stay tuned. This could be appearing definitely sometime in the next few months. Well, that was my episode on the Forgotten Women of Literature, Marghanita Laski. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something. I think she's a fantastic, wonderfully interesting character, so check her out in your own time if you are interested. As always, thank you so much for joining me. I hope you enjoyed yourselves, and yeah, we'll see you next time.